Picture the scene. It is January 16th, 1920. The United States has just embarked on what Herbert Hoover would later call the Noble Experiment. The 18th Amendment is in effect. The Volstead Act is the law of the land. Alcohol, manufacturing it, selling it, transporting it, is officially illegal. It is the dawn of a new, dry moral era, or at least that was the press release. The reality, however, was considerably wetter. Precisely. While pastors preached sobriety from the pulpit and federal agents took axes to beer barrels in the streets, a quiet, peculiar hypocrisy was taking root in the very building where those laws were written. If you were standing outside the Cannon House office building in the early 1920s, you might have noticed a man. Average height, unassuming face, perhaps a bit weary-looking. There were thousands of men like that in D.C. What made him different? Two things. First, he was carrying a large, sturdy leather briefcase that seemed heavier than it should be. And second, he was wearing a bright felt green fedora. The green hat. The green hat. This man wasn't a lobbyist, he wasn't a staffer, and he certainly wasn't a politician. His name was George Cassiday, and for 10 years, he was the most important man in Congress, because George Cassiday was the man keeping the United States government drunk. It really is one of the most staggering examples of cognitive dissonance in American history. You have men on the floor of the House giving thunderous speeches about the evils of liquor, and then retreating to their offices to buy a quart of bourbon from George. Today, we are walking through the marble halls of the Capitol, following the man in the green hat. We are going to look at the mechanics of his operation, the sheer scale of the corruption, and how one World War I veteran exposed the lie at the heart of Prohibition. So before we get into the illicit deliveries, who was George Cassiday? Was he a career criminal, a mobster sent down from Chicago? Not even close. That's what makes this story so uniquely Washington. George Cassiday was as blue-collar and average as they came. He was a veteran of the First World War. He served his country, came home, and found himself in a difficult spot. The post-war economy wasn't exactly booming for returning soldiers. He needed a job, the classic plight of the veteran. So how does an unemployed soldier end up becoming the personal bartender to the legislative branch? It was accidental. In 1920, right as Prohibition is kicking in, George is looking for work. A friend of his suggests he could make a few dollars running errands for some congressmen. Now, errands in D.C. can mean a lot of things, but in 1920, the most pressing errand for a politician who had just voted to ban alcohol was, ironically, finding alcohol. I imagine the supply chain had been disrupted. Exactly. Before the Volstead Act, a congressman could just walk down to a local tavern or have a case delivered to his home openly. Now that infrastructure was gone, they needed a fixer. Cassiday started small. He'd pick up a few bottles for a couple of Southern representatives who, despite their public dry stance, enjoyed their bourbon. It's interesting you mentioned Southern representatives. The South was a stronghold for the Prohibition movement. Publicly, yes. Privately, not so much. Cassiday quickly realized two things. One, the demand was insatiable. And two, these politicians were terrible tippers, but they offered something better than money: protection, or at least implied protection. He realized he could turn this ad hoc errand running into a full-time business, so he sets up shop. But why did he get the name? Why wear a green hat if you're committing a federal crime? Isn't the point of being a bootlegger to be invisible? In the street? Yes, but inside the Cannon building, he needed to be visible to the right people. He needed a brand. The green hat became a signal. If a congressman looked out his office door and saw the green felt hat bobbing down the hallway, he knew the bar was open. It was a flag. It said, "I'm here and I'm holding."
That is incredibly brazen. He was walking past Capitol Police daily, multiple times a day. And this is where the backstory of the Capitol Police at the time comes in. These weren't the highly trained, militarized security forces we see today. They were patronage hires, often older men, friends of politicians, looking for a soft job. They knew who George was. They knew who George was visiting. Stopping George meant embarrassing a congressman, and embarrassing a congressman meant losing your job. So the corruption wasn't just the buying of alcohol, it was the entire ecosystem allowing him to walk through the door. Precisely. Cassiday wasn't sneaking in through steam tunnels. He walked in the front door. He later estimated he supplied roughly 600 bottles of liquor a week to Congress. A week! He was a one-man logistics firm. Where was he getting the supply? He wasn't making bathtub gin, was he? No, his clientele had refined palates. They wouldn't drink rot gut. Cassiday sourced high-quality imports. He dealt with the larger syndicates who were bringing in scotch and whiskey from Canada or the Caribbean. He was the final mile delivery service. He ensured quality control, because if he poisoned a congressman, his business was over. He was a bootlegger, but he considered himself a gentleman serving gentlemen. Let's zoom in on the operation itself, because the logistics are fascinating. By the mid-1920s, George Cassiday isn't just a visitor, he is essentially a tenant. He had a base of operations inside the House office building. Wait, he had an office inside the government building? He had a storage room. He had access to the basement. He would arrive in the morning with a large leather suitcase. It was reinforced to hold about 40 pounds of glass and liquid. He'd pack it with quart bottles wrapped in newspaper or felt to stop the clinking sound. The clinking would be a dead giveaway. He was a professional. He'd make his rounds. He had a specific knock. He wouldn't just barge in. He'd knock, enter, exchange the goods for cash, and leave. It was efficient. But here's the detail that blows my mind. He kept his surplus stock in the house stationery room. The stationery room, hiding whiskey behind the letterhead? It was the perfect cover. Nobody checks the stationery room for contraband. But as his business grew, the house side got a little too hot. There was a small bust, not of him but of a staffer, that made people nervous. So what does George do? He expands. He moves his primary operations to the Senate office building, now the Russell Senate office building. Moving on up to the upper chamber. And the senators were even better customers. Cassiday later claimed that 4 out of 5 lawmakers were customers. That is 80%. Think about that number. 80% of the people paid to uphold the Constitution were paying George Cassiday to violate it. Did he have a favorite customer, or perhaps a most hypocritical one? He never named specific names in a way that would ruin a specific life. He had a code of honor, but he described the types. There was one senator, a staunch dry voter, who would buy quarts of bourbon and hide them in his office bookshelf behind the congressional record. He'd sip it out of a teacup during meetings. The classic cold tea trick. And there were the parties. When Congress went into a late-night session, Cassiday would be working overtime. He described poker games in committee rooms where the chips were piled high and the whiskey flowed freely, all while the debate on the floor was about tightening enforcement of the Volstead Act. It seems almost unsustainable. Someone had to notice. You can't have a guy in a green hat running a liquor store in the Capitol basement forever. You're right, the clock was ticking. By 1925, Cassiday had actually been arrested once. He was caught entering the House office building. But get this, he was wearing a light green hat and a light suit. The police found the bottles. They arrested him. And that was the end?
No, it was a minor inconvenience. The congressman he supplied didn't want him in jail because then the supply would dry up. He got off with a slap on the wrist. But he learned a lesson. He couldn't be so obvious. He stopped wearing the green hat every day. He switched to different entrances. But he didn't stop selling. In fact, he claimed business increased after the arrest because the publicity gave him street cred. If he's good enough to get arrested at the Capitol, he must have the good stuff.
That is perverse marketing logic, but it makes sense. So he returns to the Senate side.
He does, for 5 more years. From 1925 to 1930, he is the king of the hill. He even had a dedicated workspace in the Senate office building where he could sit and read the paper while waiting for orders. He was practically staff. He knew the Capitol layout better than most elected officials. He knew which elevators to use to avoid the press, which stairwells were unmonitored. He was a ghost in the machine. But 1930 changed everything. The mood in the country was shifting. The Great Depression had started. People were less tolerant of the fun side of the Roaring Twenties. The climate hardened, and there was a new Prohibition commissioner, a man who wanted to make a splash. The gentleman's agreement that protected Cassiday was fraying. The vice squad was under pressure to show results. They couldn't just arrest poor people in speakeasies anymore. They needed a headline. And George Cassiday was the headline. They set up a sting. It wasn't sophisticated. They had a plant, an observer, watch Cassiday's movements. They tracked him to the Senate parking lot. On February 18, 1930, George Cassiday walked toward the Senate office building. He was carrying the black suitcase. A Prohibition agent named Roger Wilson stepped out. "What do you have there, George?" Did he run? No, he knew the game. He simply handed over the bag. Inside were 6 bottles of gin and whiskey. He was booked. This time, however, the protection wasn't there. The senators who had slapped him on the back the day before suddenly didn't know who he was. The doors that were always open were suddenly locked. That betrayal must have stung more than the arrest. He served these men for a decade. It did. Cassiday was a loyal soldier to his customers, but when they hung him out to dry, he realized he had one card left to play. He pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 18 months in jail. But before he went away, he decided to tell his story, and he chose the biggest megaphone in town, the Washington Post. This is the series of articles, right? Yes. In late 1930, the Washington Post published a series of front-page articles titled The Confessions of a Capital Bootlegger. They were ghostwritten, but the voice was pure Cassiday, and they were explosive. What did he reveal? Did he name names? He stopped just short of printing a list of names, but he gave enough identifying details that everyone in D.C. knew who he was talking about. He broke down the numbers, he stated that the Senate was wetter than the House, he detailed how he stored liquor in the humidors of the House library, he described how members would vote for stricter penalties for bootlegging at 2 p.m. and then buy a bottle from him at 2:30 p.m. The public reaction must have been furious. It was electric. You have to remember, this is 1930. The Depression is crushing people. The public is tired of the moralizing. When they read that their leaders were flouting the law so flagrantly, it shattered the last remnants of respect for Prohibition. It highlighted the class divide. Alcohol was illegal for the poor, but flowing freely for the powerful. It turned Cassiday into a bit of a folk hero, didn't it? Absolutely. He wasn't seen as a criminal. He was seen as the guy who pulled back the curtain. The articles were syndicated across the country. They played a massive psychological role in the 1930 midterm elections, which saw a huge wave of wet candidates. Politicians favoring repeal swept into office.
So, in a strange way, the bootlegger helped kill Prohibition. He did. His testimony, his public confession, proved that the law was unenforceable even at the highest levels of government. If you couldn't keep the Capitol dry, how could you keep Chicago or New York dry? It was the final nail in the coffin for the credibility of the Volstead Act.
What happened to George after prison? Did he go back to the trade?
No, he served his time, mostly at a prison camp, not a hard labor penitentiary. When he got out, Prohibition was on its deathbed. Repeal happened in 1933. There was no need for a bootlegger anymore. George lived a quiet life after that. He worked in a shoe factory, he lived simply. He died in 1967, relatively obscurely. But for those 10 years, he was the shadow power of Washington. George Cassiday, the man in the green hat, remains a singular figure in American history. He wasn't a gangster with a Tommy gun. He was a man with a suitcase and a smile, walking the marble halls of power. He proved that you can legislate morality, but you cannot legislate thirst, especially not the thirst of a congressman. And he proved that the loudest voices for the law are often the first ones to break it. To truly understand the sheer scale of hypocrisy gripping Washington, D.C. in the 1920s, you have to look away from the polished marble floors of the rotunda and head down into the basements, specifically the basement of the Cannon House office building. While the Volstead Act was the law of the land, enforcing a strict ban on the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors, the very men who passed that law were busy creating a subterranean speakeasy right under their own desks. And at the center of this underground network wasn't a mob boss with a Tommy gun or a scarred gangster from Chicago. It was a mild-mannered World War I veteran named George Cassiday. He didn't look like a criminal mastermind. He looked like an average government clerk. Except for one very specific sartorial choice that would eventually make him famous, the hat, a distinct forest green felt hat. He wore it every single day. It became his calling card, his trademark, and eventually his code name. To the Capitol Police, the press, and the thirsty politicians roaming the halls, he was simply the man in the green hat. It's incredible when you think about the visibility of it. In a city trying to project an image of moral purity, here is a man walking into federal buildings with a bright green hat and a heavy briefcase multiple times a day. George Cassiday wasn't sneaking in through the coal chute. He was walking through the front door. Exactly. He started his operation around 1920, right at the dawn of Prohibition. Cassiday had returned from the war and found himself, like many veterans, struggling to find steady work. He needed a job. But he had connections. He had friends who worked on the Hill, and they tipped him off to a very specific vacancy in the market. The congressmen were dry,
and they were desperate. It really highlights the immediate failure of the legislation. The ink wasn't even dry on the 18th Amendment before the people who wrote it started looking for a loophole. Cassiday later admitted that he didn't seek out the bootlegging life. He was essentially recruited by lawmakers who needed a reliable supply chain. His first deliveries were modest. He'd carry a sturdy leather briefcase, usually packed with a few quarts of whiskey or gin. He'd enter the house office building, nod to the doorkeepers, who certainly knew what was going on, and make his rounds. He wasn't stopping at 1 or 2 offices. We're talking about a route, like a mailman, but for bourbon. And let's talk about the logistics here. The Capitol complex is massive. You have the House side and the Senate side. Cassiday set up his headquarters in the Cannon building. He actually had a space to operate from. This wasn't a guy selling out of a trench coat in an alley. He had a base of operations inside the federal government.
It was an open secret. In fact, it was so open that Cassiday claimed he supplied alcohol to 4 out of every 5 congressmen. Think about that statistic. 80% of the House of Representatives. These are the men giving speeches on the floor about the evils of demon rum, and then retreating to their offices to pour a glass of what George had just dropped off. The bipartisan nature of his business is fascinating too. Prohibition was a politically charged issue, but thirst apparently had no party affiliation. Democrats, Republicans, wets, dries, it didn't matter. If they had the cash, George had the stash. He noted later that while they fought tooth and nail on the House floor, in the back rooms, they drank from the same bottle. He actually kept a ledger, a black book. It contained the names of his customers, their preferred orders, and their debts. That book was probably the most dangerous document in Washington, D.C. at the time. If that list had been made public in 1922 or 1923, the government would have collapsed overnight. And George knew the power of that information. But for a long time, he was a loyal soldier. He protected his clients. He provided a service. He was making roughly 25 trips a day into the House office building. 25 trips. Imagine the sheer weight of liquor he was moving through those corridors. The sheer volume meant he needed a better system than just a briefcase. He eventually upgraded. He started storing his inventory in a room in the basement that was ostensibly used for storage by a representative. He had keys, he had access, he was practically a staff member. He would store cases of liquor down there and then distribute them as orders came in. What sort of alcohol are we talking about? Was this high-end stuff or bathtub gin? It was a mix. In the early days, there was still a lot of pre-Prohibition bonded whiskey floating around, the good stuff that had been stockpiled. But as the 20s roared on, that supply dried up. Cassiday had to source from other bootleggers who were bringing in rum from the Caribbean or whiskey from Canada. He prided himself on quality control, though. He knew that poisoning a congressman was a bad business model. I imagine the bad business model would be a swift ticket to a federal penitentiary, but for 5 years he operated with total impunity. It wasn't until 1925 that his luck hit a snag, and even then the circumstances were almost comical. The 1925 bust. This is where the story shifts from a smooth operation to a farce. Cassiday was entering the House office building as usual. He had his green hat, his briefcase, but on this particular day, a police officer stopped him. Now, usually the Capitol Police turned a blind eye, but the political pressure was mounting. There were rumors. The press was sniffing around. They found 6 quarts of whiskey in his briefcase. But here is the kicker. When they arrested him, they found something else. He was wearing a specially tailored pair of trousers with deep, reinforced pockets along the legs. He had pint bottles stuffed down his pants. The man was a walking liquor cabinet. That arrest should have been the end of him, caught red-handed inside a federal building with contraband. But remember who his friends were. The very people who could pull strings were his best customers. He was banned from the House office building? Yes. But did he go to jail? No. He got a slap on the wrist. And this is where the adaptability of George Cassiday shines. Banned from the House? Fine. I'll just go next door. He moved his operations to the Senate. It sounds like a joke, but it's true. The House was too hot for him, so he set up shop in the Russell Senate office building, and the senators were just as thirsty as the representatives. In fact, Cassiday later remarked that the senators were generally better tippers and drank higher quality liquor. The upper chamber, indeed.
So from 1925 to 1930, he's running the Senate booze trade. He's got an office in the Russell building. He's practically part of the furniture. He even claimed to have stored liquor in the vice president's supply room at one point. The audacity is staggering. But the climate was changing. By 1929 and 30, the Great Depression had hit. The mood in the country was darkening. People were less amused by the antics of the elite. And the Prohibition Bureau, which had been widely seen as incompetent, was under new pressure to show results. They needed a high-profile win. Enter Roger Whalen, a Prohibition agent who was willing to do what the Capitol Police wouldn't. He set up a sting. They couldn't just grab Cassiday. They needed to catch him in the act of a sale to a federal agent or prove the distribution network. They initiated a surveillance operation on the Senate side. They watched him. They clocked his movements. They saw the green hat coming and going. And in February of 1930, they made their move. They caught him making a delivery. This time, there was no sweeping it under the rug. The bust was public. The press was there. The man in the green hat was headlines coast to coast. This arrest was different. The political protection he had relied on evaporated. Why? Because it was an election year. No senator wanted to be seen intervening on behalf of a bootlegger when the public was angry about corruption. George was left out in the cold. He was convicted. The judge sentenced him to 18 months in prison. For a man who had served the most powerful people in the country for a decade, this felt like a profound betrayal. He had kept their secrets. He had fueled their parties. And now they were letting him rot. But George Cassiday wasn't going to go quietly. And this is my favorite part of the story, the revenge. He didn't pull a gun. He didn't start a riot. He picked up a pen. On the eve of his sentencing, he contacted the Washington Post. He offered them an exclusive, a series of articles detailing his 10 years as the bootlegger to Congress. He wouldn't name specific names. He was too much of a gentleman for that, or perhaps he wanted to avoid a lawsuit. But he would tell everything else: the methods, the locations, the habits, the hypocrisy. The Washington Post ran the series in the fall of 1930. It was explosive. It was 5 front-page articles. The title was simply "The Man in the Green Hat," and the content was devastating for the dry cause. He described how members of Congress would hide their liquor in hollowed-out books in their office libraries. He talked about the barflies, the nickname he gave to the regulars. He described how during late-night legislative sessions, the demand for alcohol would spike, and he'd be running back and forth from his stockpile to the floor of the House. One of the most damaging things he wrote was an analysis of the voting records versus the drinking habits. He pointed out that some of the most vocal, dry politicians, the ones giving fire and brimstone speeches about the sanctity of the law, were his best customers. He exposed the moral rot at the core of the government. He wrote, "I have served liquor to members of the House and Senate who voted for the Volstead Act and then came back to their offices and drank the very thing they legislated against." That sentence alone did more to undermine Prohibition than 1,000 protests. It made the lawmakers look like fools and hypocrites. The timing was perfect. The country was already turning against Prohibition. The violence of the gang wars, the loss of tax revenue during the Depression, and now the revelation that Congress itself was wet. It was the final nail in the coffin. The Wickersham Commission, which had been established by President Hoover to study Prohibition enforcement, was releasing its report around this time. Cassiday's articles made their findings look ridiculous. The commission said enforcement was difficult. Cassiday proved it was impossible because the enforcers were the ones breaking the law. The fallout was immense. The Speaker of the House, Nicholas Longworth, who was by all accounts a man who enjoyed a drink himself, was furious. Not at the drinking, but at the exposure. The institution of Congress had been embarrassed. But for Cassiday, it was a masterstroke. He served his time, yes, he went to prison, but he went in as a folk hero, not a common criminal. When he got out, the world had changed. In 1933, the 21st Amendment was ratified. Prohibition was repealed. The experiment was over. And in a way, George Cassiday had helped end it. By shining a light on the hypocrisy in the Capitol, he helped the American public see that the law was a sham. So what happened to the man in the green hat after the booze started flowing legally again? He lived a quiet life. He stayed in the Washington area. He never went back to bootlegging. There was no need for it, and the money wasn't there anymore. He worked in a shoe factory for a while. He passed away in 1967, largely forgotten by the public, but his legacy is cemented in the history of the Capitol. It's a classic American story. The hustle, the rise, the fall, and the redemption. But it's also a warning. It reminds us that laws are only as strong as the people who follow them, and when the people making the laws don't follow them, the system breaks. George Cassiday wasn't a villain. He was a symptom. He was the supply to a demand that the government tried to legislate out of existence. He was just a man with a green hat and a briefcase, walking the marble halls, keeping the wheels of government greased, one pint at a time. I want to go back to those articles for a second. There's a specific detail in the third installment that I think captures the absurdity perfectly. Cassiday mentions the disposal of the empty bottles. You can't just throw hundreds of whiskey bottles in the Senate trash without raising eyebrows. That's right, he described how the janitorial staff was essentially in on it too. It was a vertically integrated conspiracy. The cleaners would smuggle the glass out, or in some cases, the members of Congress would smash the bottles in their fireplaces to hide the evidence. Imagine a senator late at night smashing gin bottles in his office fireplace. And let's not forget the sheer physical toll this took on George. We picture him as this jaunty figure, but hauling cases of liquor is hard work. He described the physical exhaustion of carrying 50 pounds of liquid through the tunnels connecting the office buildings to the Capitol. Those tunnels are long. He was working incredibly long hours. Congress doesn't keep a 9-to-5 schedule. When they were in session late, debating tariffs or farm bills, George had to be on call. He was essentially the concierge of the Capitol. If a debate went until 2 a.m., George was there until 2 a.m. There is also the financial aspect. How much money was he making? Was he getting rich? He made a good living, certainly better than the average clerk, but he wasn't buying yachts. A lot of his profit was eaten up by overhead. He had to pay his suppliers, he had to pay bribes, though he was discreet about who he bribed, and he had to cover the losses from confiscations or broken bottles. Plus, selling to congressmen came with a unique risk: slow payers. That's ironic. The people making the federal budget couldn't balance their own tab with the bootlegger. Exactly. Cassiday noted that collecting payment was often the hardest part of the job. You can't exactly take a United States senator to small claims court for an unpaid whiskey bill. He had to use diplomacy. He had to be charming. He had to extend credit. That black book of his was full of IOUs. It makes you wonder if any of the legislation passed in the 1920s was influenced by who owed George money. Vote for this bill and I'll clear your tab.
There's no evidence of direct blackmail, but the leverage was undeniable. The mere existence of Cassiday in those halls shifted the power dynamic. He knew their vices. He saw them when their guards were down. He saw the solemn statesman giggling over a bottle of rye. We talked about the 1925 bust, but we gloss over the specific charge: possession. But his defense lawyer actually tried a very bold strategy. He argued that since the liquor was found in the House office building, it was technically under the jurisdiction of Congress, not the DC police.
That's a key point: the separation of powers. They tried to argue that the police had no right to search a congressional workspace. It didn't work in court, but it shows the mindset. They believed the Capitol was a sanctuary, a fortress where the laws of the outside world didn't apply. And for 10 years, they were right. It was a fortress, a wet, boozy fortress, until George Cassiday blew the gates open. When the Washington Post series ended, the public reaction was a mix of amusement and outrage, but mostly it was validation. Everyone suspected politicians were hypocrites, but having the receipts, literally the ledger details, printed in the paper was vindication for the average citizen who couldn't get a beer without risking arrest. It really demystified the government. Before Watergate, before the modern scandals, this was one of the first times the curtain was pulled back so completely on the personal conduct of federal lawmakers. And George Cassiday, the man in the green hat, was the one pulling the cord. He wasn't a crusader. He was a businessman who got burned and decided to burn the house down on his way out. I think about that green hat. It's such a flamboyant touch. Why do you think he wore it? Why not blend in? Branding. In a sea of gray suits and black fedoras, the green hat was a beacon. It signaled to his customers, I'm here, I'm open for business. It allowed him to be visible to the right people while just looking like an eccentric to everyone else. Until, of course, everyone knew what it meant. It's brilliant marketing, risky but brilliant. You know, when we look back at Prohibition, we usually focus on Al Capone, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, the rum runners on the coast. But the story of George Cassiday is just as important. I'd argue it's more important. Capone showed us the violence of Prohibition. Cassiday showed us the failure of Prohibition. He showed us that you cannot legislate morality, especially when the legislators themselves aren't buying it. The failure was systemic. It wasn't just about supply and demand. It was about a fundamental disconnect between the government and the governed. Cassiday bridged that gap, ironically. So as we wrap up the story of the man in the green hat, we're left with an image, not of a gangster, but of a man in a rumpled suit, green felt hat perched on his head, walking heavily down a marble corridor in the Cannon Building, the clinking of glass muffled by leather. A man who knew the secrets of the most powerful nation on earth and who for a decade kept the party going while the rest of the country went dry. The bootlegger to Congress, George Cassiday, a true American original. You know, there is one last footnote to his life that I find touching. Years later, after repeal, he would occasionally run into old customers, former congressmen, on the street in D.C.
Oh, really? What would happen?
They would tip their hats, a silent acknowledgement. No words exchanged, just a nod, a shared memory of the days when the only thing flowing in the Capitol basement was illegal rye, a shared secret among veterans of the Prohibition Wars. It's fitting. The era was defined by secrets, and they carried theirs to the grave. But thanks to George's articles and historians digging through the archives, the secret didn't stay buried forever. We know now exactly what was happening behind those closed doors.
And that is the story of the man in the green hat. A reminder that sometimes the most interesting history isn't made in the Senate chamber, but in the basement underneath it.
If you walk through the Cannon House office building today, the tunnels are still there. The offices are still there. The marble is the same. It's quiet now, but if you listen closely, you might just hear the ghost of a clinking bottle.
Or maybe just the echo of a politician ordering a drink.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the wettest secret in Washington's dry history.